Hey there, so please read the description below to see what this is, where it came from, and how to use it. Otherwise, let's just jump straight in and get you some easy points on your next test. So first we're going to start with the anterior counterstrain points, and we're going to write out cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and rib. And then we'll do our advanced organizer for side bending and rotation. Because these are anterior points, they are all done in flexion. And then after that, it's just pattern recognition. So it goes AT, AT, AA, TT. Then we'll move on to our maverick points. First up, we'll do C1 mandible and C1 transverse process. For the advanced organizer, I like to just keep it as M and L, medial lateral if you will. The gross movement for both of these is rotate away. However, I have been tested before multiple times on the fine tuning between these two as well. So for the mandible, I like to just copy what was up here because it's the exact same. But for the atlas, there's no flexion or extension component, so it is treated in neutral, but it can be either side bent away or towards the tender point. Moving on from there, we have our C7, T1 through 7, and then we have L1. We'll tackle C7 and L1 together because they're treated the same way. They are right there during the transition to the thoracics, and so they kind of are treated like thoracic. So I just copy what's up here. Now, the thoracics are just treated in flexion with the exception of T7. T7 is treated in flexion, but they can indicate a side, so it can also have side bending toward a direction. The last one is L5. I try not to think anymore when I get done with any section. And so for this one, it's just the same as the cervical, and so I just copy it down here. And that's it for all of our anterior points. So on the posterior, I use a few rules just to keep myself sane, and I'll tell you all three of them. So first, when I write out the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, rib, I actually offset the thoracic. We'll come back to that. Then, when I start to write out the advanced organizer, I skip the lumbar. And the last one I do, up here, this is actually going to be the thoracic spinous process, but I like to use M and L for everything. So we're just going to call this M. And since they're all posterior points, they're going to be treated in extension, and they'll all be treated away. For the lumbar, I like to write figure 4 because when you take the hip and move it into extension, abduction, and external rotation, particularly with the left foot or the left leg, the way the legs kind of look, it's like a number 4. So I call it the figure 4. We had 6 maverick points on the anterior. We're going to have 6 as well on the posterior. First up, we'll have the C1 inion, the C2 occiput, and the C1 occiput. And I write it this way because anatomically that's kind of the way they look. C2 occiput is almost sort of in between both C1 inion and occiput. Now when I told my classmates that I was going to make this little video for y'all, they said I should charge a fee. So there you go, that's the fee. For C3, that's the oddball. It is treated in flexion. It's a posterior point that is treated in flexion. Otherwise, it's still treated just like the posterior cervical. For the transverse process of the thoracic region, I like to write in L for lateral, but I also jokingly will read this as thoracic lumbar to call to my mind this part of the advanced organizer. So this part is treated much like the lumbar on the anterior, but instead, because it is a posterior, it is still in extension. So I just copy over here. The last point, and I try not to think anymore, is rib 1, and it's the exact same thing right here. So this is where Online Med Ed ends. They did not include the section between, or the differences between the spinous process and the transverse process for the thoracic region, so that's some free points. I don't think they covered the differences in the fine tuning, that's some more free points. And the last thing I want to do, and they didn't have this on there, is just show you something to help bring some of the pelvis points to mind. This won't be pretty, but it's something. So for the anterior pelvis, we have the 4 points. We have the iliacus, we have the psoas, we have the low ilium, and we have the inguinal ligament. I refer to everything as a frog in the anterior because you kind of bow out the legs and flex them and they kind of look like frog legs. Here's a free point for your CSA. Make sure to flex them past 90 degrees. So with the frog, you just take both legs and go straight up. The next one for psoas is you're going to do the frog, but you're actually going to side bend it towards the direction that the tender point is on. The low ilium, I like to think of this one as the one-legged frog. Let's see, how did I write that? And lastly, the inguinal ligament. It's the only one you actually have to remember. It's going to be the good leg over the bad leg. So sometimes I'll write that up here just to remind myself on my test. But this is the cross-legged frog. You're kind of taking the contralateral leg, bending it over the ipsilateral knee, and just side bending everything towards the tender side. So for your anterior points, you are always on the same side as the tender point. If you look at the picture that Dr. Shea is doing this particular one on, just know that she is doing it correctly. The tender point is underneath her finger, not her thumb. So she is standing on the correct side. They always explain this the first time you see that image, but when you look that PowerPoint up a year later to answer a quiz question or something, you're going to confuse yourself because you won't remember that. So consider this your reminder. For the posterior pelvis, we have the piriformis. We have the LPL5, PLT, and PLT3 and 4. I actually sometimes will just write over here because it is also treated like a figure 4. PLT3 and 4. We have the lateral trochanter and the IT band. We have the hissy, and we have the hypho. So what I like to do with these last three is I draw a straight line underneath them to remind myself that they are all treated with straight legs. Piriformis is the peeing dog. LPL5 is the bad peeing dog. The IT band is just treated with abduction. However, I have been tested on the fine-tuning and flexion before. The hissy is the only one I do brute force on. It's basically a figure 4, but the leg is straight. But it's otherwise extension, abduction, and external rotation. And then the hypho is the one that breaks the rule. So as I said earlier, I like to write good over bad at the very top of my organizer, but the hypho is the one that breaks the rule and is actually bad over good. The last thing I want to say is it's very easy to get a few of these points very quickly on your exam. So just practice this once or twice the day before your exam. And then during your exam, if you feel like you need to, you can quickly write out at least a good majority of this information.